I am very inspired by this movement. It's wonderful to be here. This is the first of these that I've been to. I was supposed to come last year, and I had to bug out for some reason I don't recall, probably insufficient. But I'm very glad to be here. And what Rob said is true. I was so inspired by Susan's talk and by our conversation over dinner that I completely revamped my talk. So what you may find is that I'm flustering around looking for where's that page that I put out of place. But I think it's really important to kind of build on and springboard off of some of the things she said. And incidentally, she's someone whom I have admired from afar for many years. My wife and I homeschooled our children, and so we were well aware of her work and made use of it. So that's yet another reason I'm happy to be here. But what I think the talk that she gave was very interesting in kind of opening the hood, so to speak, and looking at the way historians go about what they do and fallacies to which we're prone, which is always important to remember and keep in mind. And I wanted to just build on that and talk a little bit at first. I am going to talk about Land of Hope eventually if I don't run out of time. But I want to talk at first about history as a way of knowing, history as not just a form of knowledge, not just a body of knowledge, but a way of knowing that is distinct and distinctive, and in that sense is representative of the distinctive way of knowing that the humanities offer. Okay, so I want to begin thinking about muses. We were Clio, or Clio as some people say, was invoked repeatedly in the promotional materials. I don't know how often she's been invoked since then. But and of course, epics begin with the evocation of the muse, a request for the inspiration of the muse. Menina aidethea thea in the Iliad. Even John Milton does it in a sort of a way. He's really clearly talking about the Holy Spirit, but he says heavenly goddess at the beginning of Paradise Lost. So this is a tradition of the epic form. You'd have to look very hard to find anything that invokes Clio at the outset. Herodotus does not do that. I actually looked it up just to be sure. He says, "This is the display of the inquiry of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by the Hellenes, some by the barbarians, not lose their glory," and so on. So there's no sing goddess, fill me up. On the contrary, Clio doesn't sing much. She's got a very, she doesn't have perfect pitch. Let's put it that way. So, and in that sense, she's not a very useful goddess, even though she's the goddess that we got for this occasion. History is the work of the imagination, but it's the work of, and I borrow a term from Cushing Strout, a American Studies scholar of a different generation, the voracious imagination. Not voracious, veracious. That is the truthful imagination, the imagination that puts together the factual record in a faithful but also creative way. There is a lot of creativity, as Susan brought out, in the fashioning of historical narratives or trains of logic. They don't automatically assemble themselves. We have to do it. We have to do that work. And there's a lot of similarity. I don't want to take this too far, but there is a lot of similarity with fiction. Fiction has to have verisimilitude also to be persuasive, at least the standard 19th century novel. Maybe from the 20th century on, that's all gone to hell. But fiction, good fiction, should have a believability about it. except for a few genres like fantasy, perhaps science fiction. Science fiction, the aliens always, if they're advanced aliens, they always have British accents, which I sort of like. Very refined, they're either or a British accent. There's not a whole lot in between. What about the idea, again, that Susan brought up, of history as science? I think she quite properly dismissed it, and I would do the same, a little more, with a few more pummelings. I think it's important to be careful about that, but because there's much about the methods of science, the care of science, the weighing of evidence, the attempt to disaggregate variables. That's the essence of an effective scientific experiment. There's much in that way of thinking that people who practice history, historical inquiry, ought to imitate. But the scientific method itself is impossible to pursue. Why? Because history is, and this is one of my epigraphs for the day, history is the science of incommensurable things and unrepeatable events. Let me repeat that. History is the science of incommensurable things and unrepeatable events, which means that it is no science at all, because science depends on precisely that element, those elements of commensurability and replication to do its work. So none of the human sciences, as they're called, particularly in Europe, can be sciences because, for a number of reasons, partly because of the inherent dignity of the subject. We can't violate, or we shouldn't violate that dignity for the sake of experimentation. We don't murder to dissect, at least if we're civilized people. And partly because, and related to this, but the subject of inquiry, unlike the physics of Galileo, the subject has a consciousness. The subject has an ability to act, to deliberate, to respond, to change, to respond to interpretations that are propounded of its behavior. So it's really studying an entirely different sort of cat. You can simultaneously drop a corpse and a sack of potatoes off of the Tower of Pisa. They'll let you get up there with the potatoes. And together, if you drop them simultaneously, they will illustrate, as Galileo illustrated, a precise law of motion, of science. But this experiment will not tell you very much about the spirit that animated that plummeting corpse, its consciousness, its achievements, its failures, its dreams, its progeny, its loves and hates, its anxieties, its hopes and aspirations, its moments of glad grace and transcendence. Physics will tell you nothing about who that person was. All that it will tell you about is mass and acceleration. By such a calculus, our bodies may indeed become indistinguishable from sacks of potatoes. But thankfully, that's not the calculus of history, a reason why history is not a science. So false precision is an enemy of good history. If you try too hard to reduce everything to quantitative factors that are all on a commensurable scale, you're likely to get precision rather than accuracy. And that's an important distinction between those two words. We often confuse them. Precision using inadequate indices is not going to give you an accurate account of things. It's going to give you a precise one of something unrelated to the thing that you want to describe. So it's important to render the truth of things with the tools and vocabulary that are appropriate to its nature. You can't measure love or courage with a set of calipers. History, as Susan repeated several times, is about time. It's about us as creatures in time. Thoreau said, time is the stream I go a-fishing in. And that's also true of historians. We go a-fishing in that same stream. History as a study, as a form of knowledge, reminds us that our origins live on in us. It reminds us that we can never entirely remove the incidentals of our time and place because they never are entirely incidental. At the same time, it reminds us this has always been true for all men and women of all times. In other words, it reminds us that historicity is part of the human condition. Therefore, appreciation of the past can't be reached by mere introspection, by thinking about it a lot. Although it probably can't be reached without some measure of it, some self-knowledge that comes from that. C.S. Lewis, who's been quoted here a few times, and was, I think, not a relativist, we could all agree, nevertheless warned against universalizing oversimplifications of what he called the doctrine of the unchanging human heart. Now, this is a fundamentally historical insight. This posits that the things that separate one age from another are superficial. Let me just read a quote from Lewis. This comes from his preface to Paradise Lost. Just as if we stripped the armor off a medieval knight or the lace of a Caroline courtier, we should find beneath them an anatomy identical with our own, so it is held, if we strip off from Virgil his Roman imperialism, from Sidney his code of honor, from Lucretius his Epicurean philosophy, and from all who have it, their religion, we shall find the unchanging human heart, which he capitalizes, the unchanging human heart. And on this we are to concentrate. Well, he's utterly disdainful of this idea, none of which is to say that these authors are reducible to their attributes, to their context, which is a fallacy to which historians are prone, so that Virgil becomes nothing but Roman imperialism, as the flat-footed historicists might well contend. Nor does it mean that great literature, which has the power to touch chords of sympathy, a sense of universal humanity, a position for which Lewis would certainly be a spokesman, is any less powerful. It is, however, to point out that such universals as we are available to us to use can be apprehended only through careful attention to particulars. They can't be reduced to mere inert propositions. Like everything, generalizations must be hard won. And this is one of the things that historians insist upon. And even if they did find a way to codify them neatly, they would not stay that way for long. We never finally can reduce what we know about ourselves to a set of inert propositions, because whatever we know about ourselves or think we know becomes a part of who we are the moment we know it. At the very moment we absorb such propositions, we inch beyond their grip. Self-knowledge is, in that sense, constant transformation. Writing history is even more so because it means taking ever-moving aim at an ever-moving target with ever-changing eyes, transforming weapons, and protean intentions. History, wrote John Lukács, the Hungarian-American historian, history by its very nature is revisionist because it is the frequent and constant rethinking of the past, an enterprise that, unlike a court of law, tries its subjects through multiple jeopardy. You're never out of the woods with history. The past changes, not only because it's constantly growing, but because the things we need from it change too. And it will always be true because the writing of history is always taking its bearings from the needs of the present. How could it be otherwise when you think about it? So long as history is still a vital intellectual undertaking, indispensable to our civilized condition, it will always be proper and necessary for us to seek out precedents in the past and to do so energetically without being content to confine the past to a comfortable imprisonment in its own context. Nothing really has changed since Thucydides penned the history of the Peloponnesian War. I mean, some things have changed, but nothing with regard to historiography, the fundamental situation of it. Thucydides said that his work was sustained by the fragile hope that it would be consulted by those who desire an exact knowledge of the past as a key to the future, which in all probability will repeat or resemble the past. Well, we get a history repeating itself here, or the speculation that that might be so. What certainly is true is that the past's very few precedents are the only information that we really have about the likely outcomes for similar endeavors in the present and the future. Elusive as it is, the past is all we really know, all we have to work with. Cleo doesn't really have a laboratory, but if she did, we'd have to call it a very makeshift one. But it has to be, if it is to remain true to the things that it studies, the truths that it attempts to ascertain. So, history, am I doing something here? History is a laboratory of sorts. And by the standards of science, it's a really lousy laboratory. But it's all we have to work with. It's the only laboratory available to us to assay the possibilities of our human nature in a manner that's consistent with that nature. We can't design replicable experiments and still claim to be doing science, even in the absence of those things, and claim to be studying human beings rather than descending corpses, as in my earlier example. Chief among the things that history should teach us, especially those of us who live in the comfortable bosom of a prosperous country, a prosperous America, is what Henry James called the imagination of disaster. The study of history can be sobering and shocking and morally troubling. It should be. One doesn't have to believe in original sin to study it successfully, but it helps. By relentlessly placing on display the pervasive crookedness of the timber of humanity, history brings us back to earth, equips us to resist the powerful lure of radical expectations, and reminds us of the grimmer possibilities of human nature, possibilities that for most people living in most times have not been the least bit imaginary. So we work away in Cleo's makeshift laboratory, deducing what we can from the patient examination of singular examples. Remember, incommensurables, unrepeatables. It's a crazy way to go about things. The best analogy I can think of to science is it's like we were using deductions from a mad scientist's notebook who conducted haphazard experiments once only and recorded in detail the results of them, but never repeated them. But again, this is how the form of knowledge that we're talking about, history, is different, and how the humanities, more generally, are different, among whose number I think history should be included. It is some would argue that history is valuable to us, and this is beginning to modulate toward my book. So some would argue that history is useful to us mainly for disabusing us of false notions of the past. It's not for telling us about the things that made us, but for telling us, giving us a way to release ourselves from the power of the things that made us, and thereby confer upon us the possibility of boundless exercise of our gifts, our potentialities. If everything is constructed, everything can be dismantled and reconstructed in a manner more after our own hearts. So history's principal value in this understanding is not as a glue, something holding us together, but as a solvent, something releasing us. I think there's truth in this, and I think Susan made some points about this, and there certainly are all kinds of things, the lost cause of the South, any number of things in American history where the debunking and critical exercise of historical intellect has been absolutely necessary. But the study of history, and this is what I worry about, having been lost, the study of history ought to be directed not only at the accumulation of knowledge and the overturning of myths and legends, but also at the cultivation of a historical consciousness, which means that history is also an avenue whereby the present can escape not only from the past, but from the present. It's a way the present there's a sense in which the present imprisons us. What Susan had to say about fake news is an example of the imprisonment of the present, and the way that a historical perspective can take us out of that. Historical study ought to enlarge us, ought to deepen us, draw us out of ourselves by bringing us into serious encounter, again, Susan said some of this, with strangeness and the strange familiarity of a past that's already a part of us, if we're talking about American history, and indeed the whole history of the West. So historical consciousness, to put it in a very simple way, is the ability to see the past inherent in the present. It's actually a kind of vision, a kind of supreme achievement of consciousness. And my own life, I think of several places where I've felt this most vividly in Rome. I mean, you'd have to be adult not to have a sense of the imminence of the past and the present there. But in America, too, at places like Antietam Battlefield, Jamestown, very striking place, because the tininess of Jamestown gives you a sense of of how tiny were the beginnings of this great nation. And I thought, too, of a wonderful passage. This is an example, I think, of a kind of historical consciousness. You all remember the very end of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. And this passage, it's the next to last paragraph at the end of the book. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the Sound, Long Island Sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh, green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams for a transitory moment, enchanted moment. Man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled to an aesthetic contemplation that he neither understood nor desired, face to face with for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. There's a kind of historical consciousness operating there, the Dutch sailor's eyes, to enter into that moment, to what they must have saw, to what they must have experienced. So in drawing us out of ourselves, of our puny individual consciousness, whoever we are, history cultures us in an active sense of that word, multiple senses of that word. And as such, it is, to use a word that Rob has been using, it is a discipline formative of the soul. It shapes the soul. So that historians, I don't know how well this will play with your local school boards and such, but I don't think historians should be at all apologetic about what they do, that we fulfill an important public purpose when we do our jobs right. We don't always do our jobs right, but we fulfill an important public purpose simply by doing our jobs right. We don't need to justify ourselves in terms of practical considerations. We do our part when we preserve and advance a certain kind of consciousness and memory, traits of character on which a culture of relentless change, instant erasure, fake news, etc., has all but declared war. Human beings are by nature remembering creatures, story-making creatures. Whether it's a neurological fluke or not, I don't know. History embraces and affirms these traits, even as it insists on refining them by the light of truth. And just a few final words and then on to Land of Hope. I did want that word truth, I think, is very important, that we not be agnostic about the possibility of truth in history. Thucydides certainly believed it was possible to find the truth. And what I would say about that is that truth is always, it's always important to, you'll see with Land of Hope, I wanted to be both inspiring and truthful in the account of the American past that I give. But truth is very important. Truth is the basis of our common world. If we cannot argue constructively about historical truth and untruth, and cannot thereby open ourselves to the possibility of persuasion, then there's no reason for us even to talk about the past. If we cannot believe in the reasonable fixity of words and text, there's no reason for us to write. If we cannot believe that an author has something to offer us beyond the mere fact of his or her situatedness, identity would be another word, then there's no reason for us to read. If we cannot believe there's more to an author or a book than political or ideological commitments, there's no reason for us to listen. If history ever ceases to be the pursuit of truth, it will be nothing more than the self-regarding sentimentalism that eventuates in the will to power, the war of all against all. Well, and of course I wrote Land of Hope to avert all of that. Let me move now to talking about that, because that kind of view of history is one of the things, is the background behind this somewhat unusual textbook. So why did I write it? There were times when I was working on it when I wondered myself. In fact, I really didn't want to do it. I saw the need. I felt strongly the need, but every time that a publisher would suggest it to me, I would say, you know, I absolutely agree, and I hope you find somebody to do it. But I did think, after all the years that I've been, these many years I've been in academia, that after all the years of complaining about the way that we professional historians have fragmented and dissolved the main story of American history into 1,000 subcategories and parts, it seemed to me that at a certain point you have to stop complaining and either shut up or do something. So I finally decided to do the latter and try to do something. What I wanted to write was a textbook that was compact, relatively compact. It's not as compact as I wanted, but you know, it was hard enough to make it as compact as I did. Inexpensive, it is that compared to the competition. Accurate, authoritative, and readable. The current textbooks are really very hard to read. I find them very hard to read. I don't know what your students do, but this is a readable book. And it's truthful and inspiring. It's meant to shapen and deepen, to shape and deepen, their sense, students' sense of the land they inhabit, making them understand the land's roots, equipping them for the privileges and responsibilities of citizenship, and a sense, which is part of citizenship, I think, a sense of membership in this great enterprise, this country, the most exciting, perilous, and consequential story they're likely ever to encounter. And I want to emphasize the citizenship angle on this. I really thought of this in a way that those of us who are university professors, I don't think should be required to, I wouldn't get anywhere if I thought they should, to think in terms of what the effect of our work is on civic sensibilities, on the ability of young people to sort of understand and appropriate a knowledge of their institutions. That really should happen in secondary school. And that's really where I designed this book to go, to that kind of audience. The existing textbooks, I won't spend too much time beating up on them, but I think they all have the problem, and it's somewhat intrinsic to the whole business of making textbooks in this day and age. They present a fragmented, fractured, segmented, discontinuous account of American society. And it fails to convey to young people a sense of the larger arc of that history. What my fear is that we're losing a sense, a general grasp in this country among the young of the public meaning of our own history. Professional historiography has made enormous strides that I am proud of in the breadth and sophistication which it brings, particularly to the understanding of marginalized and inarticulate classes and peoples of the past. But this does not have to come, as it unfortunately has, at the expense of a broadly shared public knowledge and shared historical consciousness in the populace. My fear is that the story of America has been so burdened with ideological and other baggage that the study of history may actually alienate young Americans from the possibility of appreciating their own past and making it their own, which is a kind of denial of their birthright, of the essential components of a vibrant and full sense of citizenship, of participation and membership in this great story. And this is a state of affairs that just can't continue without producing serious consequences. A great nation, or even just a cohesive nation, needs a cohesive narrative and needs to convey that narrative to the rising generations effectively if it is to perpetuate itself and sustain its aspirations in the face of the challenges thrown up by the present and the future. It goes without saying that it cannot be a fairy tale version of the past. It will not be convincing if it's not truthful. But there's no necessary contradiction between a truthful account and an aspiring one. And we have ceased to provide either one consistently in our educational system. So this combination of truthfulness and inspiration, or maybe hopefulness, is exactly what I've attempted with Land of Hope. I want to read you a few things. How am I doing on time? Okay, yeah. Okay, well, does that mean I can just, huh? Oh, wow. Well, I could read my autobiography. Yeah, I will. I want to read to you first a few segments from the book. I want to read to you first the epigraph, which is usually, and this will take a while. This is not one of those, one-sentence epigraphs. It takes up the whole page. But it's a terrific epigraph, and I actually had it pinned to my computer monitor the whole time I was writing the book to remind me of what I was doing. It's from John Dos Passos, the great American novelist, great experimental novelist who was a radical in his early years and then moved to the right, and by the 1950s was, and before that, he really was writing. He became very interested in the American past and studying the American past, studying the life of Jefferson and others as a sort of resource to draw upon. And you'll see that in this passage, which I take from an essay he wrote called The Use of the Past. Every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we are driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men belonging to generations before us have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, and to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and in some measure to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it. And the second paragraph here. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past that idiot delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. That is why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions, not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backward as well as forwards. As I said, it's from an essay called The Uses of the Past. He's arguing that this sense of living connection to the past, which I think can be translated as historical consciousness, although he doesn't use the term, is a source of sustenance, even in times of great upheaval. It's a source of edification, of insight as well. And that sense can save us from what he calls the idiot delusion of the exceptional now. And what he means by that is that from the delusion that we live in a time that is so unprecedented, it's so exceptional, that's so completely without any point of reference, of meaningful reference to times in the past, that there's simply no point in studying it. It's completely discontinuous with the world that we inhabit, which I think, I don't know about you, it describes a lot of my students, that the view that they can instinctively have, that really, I mean, gosh, Winston Churchill, he was pretty cool in his time, but, he didn't have an iPhone. I mean, what, I'm ridiculing, and I don't really mean to, they can't help it. It's up to us to say, to insist that there was a world before they came onto the planet. And that world has a lot to say about everything that they do, including the prosperity and freedom that allows them to own the bloody iPhone in the first place. So and we're all prone to think this way, right? I mean, to think our time is so dramatic, so exceptional, so unsettling, that there's nothing but the present to use as a point of reference. But Dos Passos quite probably just brushes this aside as an idiot delusion. And I haven't revealed at this point, but I will reveal now, I think it's of no small interest, when this essay was written. It was written in 1941. You talk about a time when everything seemed to be collapsing. Hitler had control over all of continental Europe, only the British Isles holding out. The United States held back from participating in the war by fairly stubborn public opinion. It was a very scary time, a scary present. When he was talking about the scary present, he knew what he was talking about. Of course, this is before Pearl Harbor, which comes at the end of 1941. But it's a much more frightening moment. Some of you may disagree with this, but I think it's a much more frightening moment than the present. And yet, he is confident that the past is a resource upon which not only you can draw, you must draw. You must be able to draw on that past in order to find the sustenance to continue to be what you are and what you have been. So I've tried to write the book in that spirit, that in a view of the past that doesn't condescend to it, and certainly doesn't refrain from being critical of it, but reaches back to it at the same time, seeks to recover some of the roots of our story and present it in its fullness, its coarseness, its brutality, its failure, but also its triumphs and grandeur and world historical importance. It also, I think, is important, and this, I'm going to pitch this particular consideration in a leftish direction because I think people on the left tend to be a little more resistant to this kind of argument about history being a source of national cohesion. We need to take into account the fact that if we don't have a sort of cohesive national idea of our story, of who we are, of our narrative, that helps to hold us together and gives us something, a commonality to fall back on. This reservoir of shared memories that in certain times of crisis, we do suddenly discover we have that, but much of the time we act as if we don't. But how can we achieve common goals like health care for all Americans? There's my lefty pitch, but it's actually something everybody wants, but it's particular concern of people who are on the left. And how can you do that? How can you persuade American citizens that they need to sacrifice, to give up arrangements that may be comfortable for them, but not for many, many other people, if there's not a sense of a common purpose, of a commonality, and that ultimately is going to be grounded in a story about how we have come this far together. So I think from all sorts of perspectives, it's something we need. In a diverse society like this one, where we don't have blood and soil, we don't have sort of lines of ancestry that unite us. We don't have racial homogeneity or any kind of homogeneity, religious, you name it. We don't have it. What do we have to hold us together? Well, we have certain principles, but we also, I think those principles need to be embodied in action, in a story, and an unfolding story. So it's a book that also asks at every turn for its young readers to reflect on the meaning of history and the meaning of the past, and to think historically about, for example, the issue of slavery, and contextually. I think history is a discipline that should call to the depths of our humanity. Very often, I think most of the time, historians don't do that. But that doesn't mean that it's right not to do that. So, how are we doing it? Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the title of the book, because I think that also tells you something about what I've tried to do with it. It's Land of Hope. And, all the Anglophiles, say, why not Land of Hope and Glory? But titles are not copyrightable, so I could do the title I wanted to do. And all along, that's what I felt the book should be called. Even before I wrote a single word, I wanted that title. The book makes an argument, which is a little bit fanciful, but I said, we get to be creative around the edges, that all of the Western Hemisphere is settled by people who came from somewhere else, most of whom, freely, not all, and an exception is very important, but people who come from elsewhere, often restless and exploratory, unwilling to settle for the conditions into which they had been born, and drawn by the prospect of a new beginning. Nothing is deeper in the American soul, the American spirit, than this idea that America represents freedom, it represents a second chance at life, a possibility to pursue ambition in a context that is freer, that the old worlds, whatever old worlds one came from, did not permit. Hope is a word that has both theological and secular meanings, material meanings. And all of these meanings, I think, exist and have existed and still exist in abundance in America today. I think nothing in my mind is more definitive of America than this ubiquity of hope. The way that we believe, even those of us who are very cynical, that we believe that the way things are initially given to us cannot be the final word about them, that we can never settle for that. And this is, I think, a spiritual quality. It's an aspirational quality that I've taken a vow not to use the word DNA, or not the term DNA in reference to culture. I just won't do it. But if I did, I would say that this aspirational quality is intrinsic. It is very deeply woven into the fabric of our cultural sensibilities. Now, hope and success are not synonymous. Being a land of hope may mean being a land of disappointment, of bitter disappointment, dashed hopes, and a nation that sets its goals so high makes itself vulnerable to searing criticism when it falls short of them, as it has frequently. Viewed in the context of the history of the world, the real crime of American slavery was not slavery itself, which has been ubiquitous through most of human history up to the 18th and 19th centuries, but the disharmony, the contradiction, the hypocrisy, the incompatibility of slavery with professed American ideals. But this disharmony is part of the story. It's part of coming to a recognition that our heroes are flawed, including the founders. That all human beings are flawed. All human enterprises are flawed. But in America, this persistence of hope cannot remain defeated for very long. Okay, I'm going to conclude with an example of the book, of a longer passage in the book, and I'll stop there. But this has to do with the end of the Civil War, and it'll give you a sense of my style. But I also think there's an important message in this story about today. Maybe something that we can reach back to. So it's April of 1865. April 9th, after a last flurry of futile resistance, General Robert E. Lee, faced facts and arranged to meet Grant at a brick home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse to surrender his army. He could not formally surrender for the whole Confederacy, but the surrender of his army would trigger the surrender of all others, and so it represented the end of the Confederate cause. It was a poignant scene, dignified and restrained and sad, as when a terrible storm that has raged and blown has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange and reverent calm, purged of all passion. Excuse me. The two men had known one another in the Mexican War, but had not seen one another in nearly 20 years. Lee arrived first, wearing his elegant dress uniform, soon to be joined by Grant, clad in a mud-spattered sack coat, his trousers tucked into his muddy boots. Grant always was the fashion plate of the military. They showed one another a deep and respectful courtesy. Grant generously allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms and the men to keep their horses and take them home for the spring planting. None would be arrested or charged with treason. 4 days later, when Lee's army of 28,000 men marched in to surrender their arms and colors, General Joshua L. Chamberlain of Maine, a hero of Gettysburg, was present at the ceremony. He later wrote of his observations that day, reflecting upon the soldierly respect for the men before him, each passing by and stacking his arms, men who only days before had been his mortal foes. And here I quote from Chamberlain. Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils or sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve, standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into the Union so tested and assured? On our part, not a sound of trumpet more, nor roll of drum, nor a cheer, nor word, nor whisper of vainglorying, nor motion of man standing again at the order, but an awed stillness, rather, and breath holding, as if it were the passing of the dead. And that concludes the excerpt from Chamberlain, and now back to me. Such deep sympathies in a victory so heavily tinged with sadness and grief and death. This war was and remains to this day America's bloodiest conflict, having generated at least 1.5 million casualties on the two sides combined, including upwards of 800,000 deaths, the equivalent of 6 million men in today's American population. 1 in 4 soldiers who went to war never returned home. 1 in 13 returned home with 1 or more missing limbs. For decades to come, in every village and town in the land, one could see men bearing such scars and mutilations, a lingering reminder of the price they and others had paid. And yet, Chamberlain's words suggested there might be room in the days and years ahead for a spirit of conciliation that Lincoln had called for in his second inaugural speech, a spirit of binding up wounds, of caring for the many afflicted and bereaved, and then moving ahead together. It was a slender hope, yet a hope worth holding, worth nurturing, worth pursuing. Well, we all know it didn't turn out that way, due in large part to Lincoln's violent death at the hands of John Wilkes Booth. But the story, I think, is illustrative nonetheless. If Chamberlain's troops could find it in their hearts to be that forgiving, that generous, that respectful of men who had been only days before been their mortal enemies, we ought to be able to extend a similar generosity towards men from what is now for us a far more distant past. And we can be encouraged in that disposition by Lincoln himself, who said something similar in a cabinet meeting on April 14th, the very day of his assassination, and I read this. I hope there will be no persecution, no bloody work after the war is over. Enough lives have been sacrificed. We must extinguish our resentment if we expect harmony and union. There has been too much of a desire on the part of some of our very good friends to be masters, to interfere with and dictate to those states, to treat the people not as fellow citizens. There is too little respect for their rights, and I do not sympathize with these feelings. Again, we can only wonder what would have happened if Lincoln had lived and Reconstruction had been presided over by him. Quite possible that he would have made too many concessions to the defeated South, as his successor did. We can never know for certain, but given the high regard in which Lincoln is rightly held by most Americans, it would be a mistake not to pay attention to his example, not only in understanding the past in which he lived, but the present in which we live as well. Lincoln never lost sight of the fact that the war that consumed his presidency and finally his life would be a failure if it were not, in the end, a war of reunification and reconciliation, and not merely a war of conquest and vengeance. We will fare better in our own debates and internal conflicts if we can remember the same thing. Thank you.